A 2022 Gallup study found that low effort employees cost U.S. companies around $500 billion a year in lost productivity. That number is staggering on its own. But here's the part that actually stings. A significant portion of that cost isn't absorbed by management, it's absorbed by the person sitting next to them. Most people assume the workplace runs on a simple equation: perform well, get rewarded; work hard, get ahead. That equation feels right. It also happens to be incomplete. So why does the colleague who does the least seem to face the fewest consequences? That gap between what should happen and what actually does, that's what this video is about. Because if you don't understand the specific mechanics behind it, you'll keep filling the void they leave. You'll keep absorbing the work, covering the failures, and wondering why the system never corrects itself. It won't. Not on its own. My name is Alex, and if you've ever watched someone coast through a job, you're working twice as hard to keep. Stay with this, and because the playing field was never level to begin with. And I'm going to show you exactly how the low-effort playbook operates, and why your own work ethic is the very thing being used against you. Once you understand the mechanism, you stop reacting to it, and start making deliberate choices about where your effort actually goes. This pattern has a very specific shape, and it starts with a particular type of person, the kind who's pleasant enough that nobody wants to confront them, and unproductive enough that everyone else quietly pays the price. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. The most disruptive people in any workplace aren't usually the ones who cause obvious problems. They're the ones who cause invisible ones. Meet Daniel. He's a project coordinator at a mid-sized marketing firm. On paper, he looks fine. Shows up most days. Responds to enough messages to seem present. In meetings, he's the first to laugh at the boss's joke and the last to volunteer for anything that actually requires follow-through. Nobody dislikes Daniel. That's not the issue. The issue is that when the work needs doing, Daniel is somehow never quite available. And here's what makes him interesting. Not frustrating, interesting, because Daniel isn't failing by accident. He's found a specific equilibrium. He's figured out the exact amount of effort required to stay employed without ever being genuinely useful. That's not laziness in the way most people picture it. That's a calibration. Now, you might think someone like Daniel would stand out immediately, that managers would notice, that performance reviews would surface the pattern. In reality, a 2024 Society for Human Resource Management report found that nearly 61% of U.S. managers admit they avoid addressing underperformance because the process feels too time-consuming or emotionally draining. So the gap between what's visible and what gets acted on is much wider than most high performers realize. Daniel knows this, even if he couldn't articulate it. He knows the system has a tolerance threshold, and he stays just below it. The combination that makes him particularly hard to dislodge is simple. He is pleasant and unproductive at the same time. Those two things together create a kind of social armor. If he were difficult and lazy, he'd be an easy target. But because he's warm, agreeable, and fun to be around, any criticism of his output gets unconsciously filtered through his likability. Managers hesitate. Colleagues feel guilty. The friction of confronting him always feels slightly disproportionate to the offense. So what happens instead? The work doesn't disappear. It redistributes. This is the part that should make every high performer stop and think carefully. When Daniel drops a task, and he drops tasks regularly, always with a reasonable sounding excuse, someone else catches it. Not because they were asked to, because they can't watch something fail. That instinct, the one that makes you good at your job, is the exact instinct Daniel's behavior exploits. You stay late to fix the deck he half finished. You quietly redo the client summary he turned in with errors. You smooth over the deadline he missed by absorbing it into your own workload. And each time you do that, two things happen simultaneously. The immediate problem gets solved, which feels good, and Daniel's pattern becomes slightly more invisible, which costs you something you don't immediately notice. A 2025 Gallup workplace study found that employees who regularly absorb tasks beyond their defined role report 23% higher burnout rates within 18 months. They're also, paradoxically, less likely to be promoted in that same window because their energy is going into maintenance work rather than visible, strategic output. You're keeping the floor from caving in. Nobody gives awards for that. The uncomfortable truth at the center of all this is that you're not just tolerating Daniel's behavior. You're, in a very functional sense, subsidizing it. Every time you catch what he drops, you remove the consequence that would otherwise make his pattern visible to the people who could actually address it. And look, that's not a moral failing on your part. It comes from a good place. It comes from caring about the work, about the team, about not wanting things to fall apart on your watch. Those are real values. The problem is that Daniel's entire strategy depends on them. This is where it stops feeling like a personality quirk and starts looking like something more deliberate. Because what Daniel has quietly mastered isn't just the art of avoiding work, it's something more specific and frankly more effective. A calculated approach to how he's perceived by the people who actually decide what happens to his career. And that playbook runs a lot deeper than most people realize. Think about the last time you were genuinely impressed by a colleague. Odds are, it wasn't purely because of the quality of their work. It was because you saw them doing it, in the right room, at the right moment, in front of the right person. That's not cynicism. That's just how visibility works. And nobody has figured that out more precisely than someone like Daniel. Here's the thing about what Daniel does. It isn't random. It isn't even particularly lazy in the way most people picture laziness. Someone slumped at a desk, checked out, obviously coasting. What Daniel practices is something closer to strategic minimalism. He has quietly mapped the difference between what actually matters and what only looks like it matters. And he operates almost entirely in the second category. The core belief driving most high performers is straightforward. Work hard, exceed expectations, and the results will speak for themselves. It's a reasonable philosophy. It's also only half the equation, because in most workplace environments, results don't speak for themselves. Someone has to be in the room when they're discussed. Someone has to be associated with them at the right moment. Daniel understands this intuitively, even if he's never put it into those words. What he's done, consciously or not, is invert the usual approach. Instead of asking, "How do I do excellent work?" he asks, "How do I avoid consequences while looking credible?" Those are completely different questions, and they lead to completely different behaviors. He knows which deadlines are load-bearing and which ones are suggestions. He knows which managers track outcomes closely and which ones mostly care about how things feel in a status meeting. He knows that sending a message at 7:45 in the morning, even if the message contains nothing useful, signals something to the people who notice timestamps. He's not working harder, he's working on the perception. A 2025 LinkedIn Workplace Trends report found that employees who proactively communicated progress to senior leadership, regardless of actual output, were 34% more likely to be rated as high performers in annual reviews than employees who produced stronger results but communicated less. 34%. That's not a rounding error. That's a structural feature of how performance gets evaluated in most organizations. So while you're heads down producing actual work, Daniel is having a relaxed 12-minute conversation with the VP of operations near the coffee station. He's not networking in any formal sense. He's just maintaining visibility, keeping his name in circulation, making sure that when decisions get made about projects, about promotions, about who gets the benefit of the doubt, he feels familiar and safe to the people making them. This is the part that's easy to dismiss as unfair and hard to dismiss as ineffective, because it works. Not because the people above Daniel are foolish, but because attention is limited, perception fills the gaps. When a manager doesn't have complete information about who contributed what, they default to the people they feel connected to. Daniel makes sure he's always one of those people. Now here's the question worth sitting with. If you stripped away the moral dimension entirely, if you set aside the frustration of watching this happen, what you're left with is someone who correctly identified the actual incentive structure of their environment and optimized for it. That's not admirable, but it is precise. And the uncomfortable implication is that most high performers are optimizing for a different game entirely. They're playing by the rules of a performance system that rewards output. Daniel is playing by the rules of a visibility system that rewards presence and association. Both systems exist simultaneously. Most people only see one of them. Understanding that gap doesn't mean you have to play Daniel's game, but it does mean you have to stop being surprised when playing. Your game doesn't automatically win by default. Because the place where this asymmetry becomes most damaging isn't in how credit gets distributed quietly over time. It's in how blame gets distributed when something goes wrong. And the architecture behind that is more deliberate than most people ever stop to notice. There's a pattern that shows up in almost every workplace. And once you see it, You cannot unsee it. The people who do the least work are rarely the ones who take the blame when something goes wrong, and the people who do the most work are rarely the ones who get the credit when something goes right. That's not a coincidence. There's a specific architecture behind it. Think back to Daniel. By this point, he's established something quietly valuable. He's likable upward, meaning the people above him feel comfortable around him. And he's unreliable downward, meaning the people beside him have learned not to count on him. That combination creates a very particular dynamic. When a critical project lands on the team, the manager doesn't run through an objective list of who has capacity. They run through a mental list of who they trust to deliver. Daniel's name doesn't make that list. Yours does. So the work flows to you, not because anyone sat down and decided to overload you. Just because it's the path of least resistance for everyone involved, your manager gets the outcome they need. Daniel avoids the exposure he can't afford. And you, because you care about the work actually being done well, accept it. Here's where it gets structural. A 2025 Gallup report on U.S. employee engagement found that high performers take on an average of 31% more tasks than their job descriptions formally require. Not because they're asked explicitly, because the gap exists and they fill it. That gap has a name in organizational psychology. It's called Task Absorption, and it's one of the primary reasons high performers burn out while underperformers remain comfortably employed. You're not just doing your job. You're doing your job plus the buffer that exists, because Daniel isn't doing his. Now, watch what happens when the project succeeds. The output gets presented. The client is happy. The numbers look good. And in that meeting, the one where leadership acknowledges the result, Daniel is present, nodding, maybe adding a comment about how the team really pulled together. He didn't build the thing, but he's in the room where it's being celebrated. And proximity to a win, as unfair as it sounds, reads as a contribution to most observers. A 2024 Harvard Business Review analysis found that in team-based work environments, individuals who were physically or verbally present during outcome reporting were perceived as 40% more involved in producing those outcomes than colleagues who were absent, regardless of actual contribution levels. 40%, just for being in the room. So Daniel shares the credit, not by lying, not by explicitly claiming work he didn't do, simply by being visible at the moment the work gets recognized. Now flip it. Something goes wrong, a deadline gets missed, a client pushes back. Suddenly the question isn't who produced the outcome, it's who is responsible for the process. And here's where Daniel's strategy becomes genuinely elegant in a way that's maddening to watch up close. Because he never formally owned anything. He was always supporting the project, always looped in, never the named lead. So when accountability gets assigned, it looks for someone whose name was attached to a decision. That person is almost never Daniel. You made the call. You sent the deliverable. Your fingerprints are on it because you were actually doing the work. And that means when something goes sideways, you're the one standing in the open. This isn't manipulation in the dramatic sense. It's just the logical outcome of a system where ownership and effort flow to the same person, but credit and blame don't follow the same rules. You absorb the task, which means you absorbed the risk. Daniel avoided the task, which means he avoided the exposure. The most disorienting part isn't that this happens. It's that management often watches it happen and doesn't intervene, not because they don't care, but because from where they sit, the picture looks entirely different. And understanding why management does nothing is what actually explains how this whole dynamic stays intact. Most people assume that if a problem is visible enough, someone in charge will eventually fix it. That assumption feels reasonable. It's also one of the most expensive beliefs a high performer can hold on to, because the manager sees what's happening. They're not oblivious. They know Daniel isn't pulling his weight. They've known for a while, and they've made a decision, not dramatically, not consciously in most cases, but a decision nonetheless. They've decided that doing nothing is the better option. Understanding why they reached that conclusion is what changes how you respond to the whole situation. Start with what the manager actually sees from their position. The team's deliverables are going out on time. The client metrics look acceptable. The weekly status report has no red flags. From a purely operational standpoint, the system appears to be functioning. The fact that it's functioning because you're quietly absorbing Daniel's share of the work is not visible in any report they're reading. What's visible is the output. And the output looks fine. This is the first reason nothing changes. There is no fire. And managers, like most people, are primarily motivated to act when something is actively on fire. Now add the cost side of the equation. A 2025 Society for Human Resource Management study found that the average cost of replacing a single employee in the United States sits at approximately $4,700 in direct expenses alone, before accounting for lost productivity during the transition period, which typically runs between 8 and 12 weeks for mid-level roles. When you factor in onboarding, training, and the time a manager spends involved in the hiring process, the real number is often closer to 30% of that role's annual salary. For a position paying $68,000 a year, that's roughly $20,000 in total replacement cost. That's not a rounding error. That's a number a manager feels. So here's the calculation they're actually running, even if they'd never frame it this way out loud. On one side, the disruption, paperwork, interview cycles, onboarding lag, and political friction of addressing Daniel's underperformance formally. On the other side, the current arrangement, where the work is getting done, the numbers look acceptable, and the only real cost is being paid by you rather than by the budget. From a pure cost-benefit standpoint, the current arrangement wins. Every time. And look, I'm not saying this is good management. It isn't. But it is logical management, which is a different thing. Understanding the logic doesn't mean endorsing it. It means you stop waiting for a correction that the incentive structure makes unlikely. There's one more layer here worth naming, because it's the part that tends to sting the most. Sometimes, not always, but often enough to matter. Daniel's arrangement doesn't just get tolerated. It gets quietly rationalized. A manager who has accepted that Daniel won't deliver will occasionally frame your willingness to cover as a team dynamic that's working. They'll describe the team as collaborative. They'll note that the group is good at distributing the load. What they're really describing is a system where one person's reliability is subsidizing another person's absence, and that subsidy has been rebranded as a feature. A 2024 Deloitte Workplace Culture Survey found that 67% of U.S. managers reported feeling underprepared. To have direct performance conversations with employees, they considered culturally positive, meaning well-liked, socially integrated, and non-confrontational. Daniel, almost by design, fits that description precisely. His likability isn't incidental to his survival. It's central to it. So the manager stays quiet, the system stays stable, and you keep carrying the weight, partly because you're good at it, and partly because nobody has given you a compelling reason to stop. That's the piece most high performers miss. They're waiting for the environment to change, but the environment has already optimized around their willingness to absorb. The change, if it comes at all, has to come from somewhere else. It has to come from you, and what that actually looks like in practice. The specific strategic response that stops the cycle without blowing up your reputation in the process is exactly where this is heading next. There's a version of this story that ends with a single dramatic conversation. The high performer finally speaks up. The manager suddenly sees the truth. The underperformer gets a formal warning, and everything rebalances. That version is satisfying. It's also mostly fictional. Real change in this dynamic doesn't come from a confrontation. It comes from a quieter, more deliberate shift in how you operate. And the first thing that has to change is the belief that got you here in the first place. You were taught, implicitly, consistently, across every job you've ever had, that being a reliable team player means filling gaps. That is when something is about to fail. The right move is to prevent it. That your value is demonstrated through your willingness to absorb. Those instincts served you well in a lot of contexts. In this one, they are working directly against you. A 2025 McKinsey report on U.S. workplace productivity found that high performers who regularly exceeded their formal role boundaries were 26% less likely to receive promotions within a 2-year window than peers who maintained clearer role boundaries while investing that same energy in visible, strategic projects. Read that again, slowly. Doing more in the wrong direction with the wrong visibility actively reduces your advancement probability. The effort isn't the problem. The direction of it is. So the first shift is deceptively simple. Stop being the automatic safety net. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just stop. When Daniel's deliverable is late, let it be late. When his section of the report is missing, don't quietly fill it in before anyone notices. Let the gap exist long enough to become visible to the people who have the actual authority to address it. You are not protecting the team by covering for him. You are protecting him from the consequences that would otherwise force the situation to resolve. This feels uncomfortable, especially if you care about the work. And you do. That's the whole reason you're in this position. But there's a difference between caring about the outcome and accepting personal liability for someone else's choices. Those are not the same thing, and conflating them is exactly what the current arrangement depends on. The second shift is about where your effort goes once you've stopped absorbing his. That energy doesn't disappear, it redirects. And the place it needs to go is toward the kind of visible, attributed output that actually moves your career. No more maintenance work. Not more behind the scenes problem solving that nobody sees. Specific projects with your name attached. Outcomes that get discussed in rooms you're present in. Contributions that exist on record, not just in the memory of colleagues who already know you did the work. Here's a practical way to think about it. Every week, ask yourself one question. If someone senior reviewed my contributions from the past 5 days without asking my teammates for context, what would they actually see? If the honest answer is not much, even if you worked extremely hard, that's the gap worth closing. Not by doing more, by doing differently. The third shift is the hardest one, because it requires tolerating a specific kind of discomfort. You have to let Daniel's consequences become Daniel's problem. That means not cushioning the landing when his work falls short. It means not volunteering an excuse on his behalf in a team meeting. It means allowing the natural friction of his underperformance to surface in the places where it can actually be seen and addressed. A 2024 Cornell organizational behavior study found that underperformance in team settings became formally visible to leadership an average of 7 months, sooner when high performers stopped absorbing the associated tasks. 7 months. That's not a trivial difference. That's the difference between a problem that quietly persists for years and one that reaches the people with the power to resolve it before another annual review cycle passes. None of this requires you to become someone you're not. You don't have to be strategic in a cynical way. You don't have to stop caring about the work. You just have to care about your work specifically. And stop treating the two as interchangeable, because once you stop subsidizing the dynamic, something else becomes visible. Not just Daniel's underperformance, the full shape of the playing field you've been operating on, and why understanding that field completely is what makes everything that follows finally make sense. Here's the realization that ties all of this together. You weren't failing to see the system clearly. You were operating by a set of rules that the system doesn't actually enforce. Hard work gets rewarded. Reliability gets recognized. Gaps get corrected by the people responsible for correcting them. Those beliefs aren't wrong exactly. They're just incomplete. And that incompleteness is what made the whole thing so disorienting. Once you see the actual mechanics, the visibility gap, the credit architecture, the manager's cost-benefit logic, the way your own reliability gets used as a cushion, the confusion lifts. Your experience stops feeling like a personal failure and starts making structural sense. A few things are worth carrying forward. Effort without visibility is invisible. Covering someone's failures makes those failures disappear from everyone except you. Managers respond to problems they can see, not problems that have been quietly solved on their behalf. And the system will not self-correct as long as high performers make self-correction unnecessary. Watch for the moments you absorb something without thinking. That reflex is where the cycle restarts. There's a related question worth sitting with after this. If you did stop subsidizing the dynamic fully, consistently, what would your actual output look like? And would the organization around you be ready to see it?